Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sue Clark-Johnson, and I'm Executive Director of the Morrison Institute for Public Policy. I'm really pleased that we're able to host today's event, which is called Redistricting 101, What You Need to Know to Get Involved. Before we get to the program, I want to acknowledge a few people who made this program possible. Let me start first with thanking Chris Callahan, who is the Dean of the Cronkite School of Journalism, which is providing the venue as well as the audio and video production today so others can experience this worthwhile event later on our website. And our website is morrisoninstitute.asu.edu, and this entire program will be on the website by the end of the week. I also want to thank Gary and Jeannie Herberger for their generous support in sponsoring today's seminar. They understand that good government starts with redistricting, the very boundary lines that determine representation by those that we elect. In a democratic republic, this is where it begins. Today's event is intended to get you, the engaged citizen, the policymaker, the civil servant, the community leader, more involved in the complex but public process of redistricting. Beyond their impressive resumes, our guest speakers and panelists continue to demonstrate their commitment to the public process by offering their expertise, their experience, and their insights into redistricting. Their participation today, like your participation today, is further proof that democracy in action is truly only possible through continual citizen involvement. It does not begin and end simply by voting. So with that, allow me to introduce Dr. Jennifer Steen, an Arizona State University political science professor and a Morrison Institute contributing fellow, who has helped us better understand and explain redistricting. Jennifer, along with the Morrison Institute for Public Policy staff, put together today's program, and she's going to serve as today's moderator. So again, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And Jennifer, the afternoon is yours.
Thank you very much, Sue, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to ask you all a favor before we get started. This is my phone, and I'm switching it to mute, and so I would ask that, that all of you do the same, please. Thank you. As you may know, one of the most important functions of the Morrison Institute for Public Policy is public outreach, specifically the process of informing, assisting, and involving people in significant public issues. Similarly, our parent institution, Arizona State University, emphasizes the pursuit of research and discovery that benefits the public good. So today's program certainly serves both missions. F minus. Anybody else want to get that out of their system? Okay. Where was I? All right. By bringing together this group of distinguished teachers and committed citizen students, our goal today is to provide citizens with the information that they need about the legal, political, institutional, and geographic context in which redistricting will unfold in Arizona this year. Some of you are here as individuals, others represent associations of like-minded citizens, and still others will be drawing lines for your city or county or even for our state. For all of you, we hope that what you learn here today will facilitate your participation in the decennial redistricting. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Justin Levitt of Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. Prior to joining the faculty at Loyola, Professor Levitt was, and still is actually, a practitioner of election law. He served in a variety of capacities for presidential campaigns and nonprofit organizations. He's offered expert testimony before courts and legislatures, and he's offered public commentary in both news coverage and public opinion commentary, editorial pages. Most recently, Professor Levitt was counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, where he authored The Citizen's Guide to Redistricting, which is a valuable resource that I'd urge all of you to consult. We're delighted to have his expertise today, so thank you very much, Professor Levitt.
Well, thank you very, very much to Dr. Steen and to the Morrison Institute and to the Cronkite School, and perhaps most importantly to all of you for coming here today to learn a little bit more about the redistricting process in Arizona. As Professor Steen mentioned, this is among the most important elements of the democratic process because it's more or less at the foundation. It has to do with how people are represented, how power is apportioned, and therefore has to do with who speaks for all of you and for all of those whom you care about. My task here is to give you just a flavor, a taste of how the process works, what the relevant rules are of who's going to be conducting the process, and a little hint of how you can engage if you're interested in engaging with the process further. And then Dr. Michael McDonald will tell you a little bit more about some of the specific aspects of redistricting based, at least in part, on his experience here in Arizona. I am, as Professor Steen mentioned, a professor of law at Loyola University, Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. You'll also see on the slides a notation from the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. That's where I used to work. I was counsel with the Brennan Center, and they contributed to a great deal of the presentation you're about to see. Though I want to make clear I don't speak for them, I want to give them the credit that is due for what I'm about to present. I'm going to try to keep my remarks to the essence of what I learned in 4th grade journalism. Some very, very basic questions that will hopefully give you a flavor of what this redistricting process is anyway. And I find it often useful to start with why we're here, why engage in this process at all. We redraw the lines in part because population moves, as you well know, and when population moves from place to place around the state, districts that had embraced roughly the same number of people become lopsided. Some districts become very big, some districts become very small, and that means that the representation that each of us receives changes as people move around the country, around the state. About 14% of the population on average moves around the nation every year, and so this means that by the time we approach the end of a decade, quite a few people don't live where they used to live just a few short years beforehand. In the 60s, starting with a case called Baker versus Carr and then moving throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the Supreme Court decided that this motion created unconstitutional conditions, that the fact that different numbers of people were represented, sometimes vastly different numbers of people, were represented in different districts, was unconstitutional. Just before the 60s, for example, in California, the citizens in the smallest district of California had 422 times as much representational power as those living in the largest district, where there were 422 times the number of people who had to vie for the attention of their state senator. And so the Supreme Court decided, starting in the 60s, that this disproportion was unconstitutional and required roughly the same amount of population in each district. And so, when we know where the population is, we begin to redraw lines to roughly put the same number of people in each district. This whole process starts with the census. April 1st, 2010 was the census day. That's the day on which the census measures where all of us are. Once that information comes back to the state, we can use it in order to redraw district lines at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. March 10th, 2011 was the date that the data hit home here in Arizona. That's the date on which the Census Bureau actually delivered this information to Arizona. And so now the process has begun in local legislatures around the state and in, as we'll talk about in a moment, the state commission that's responsible for drawing both state legislative and federal lines in Arizona. Plans will be drawn over the next few months. There is inevitably a litigation cycle that follows. And really, the hard deadline not to miss is May 2012, which is the filing deadline for candidates for the 2012 elections. And well in advance, certainly from the candidates' preferences, well in advance of that filing deadline, the districts have to be drawn so that people know where to run. Because I know there are some people in the room who've been involved with the redistricting process in Arizona over the past decade, I feel compelled to add that the litigation, of course, doesn't stop there. You all had the benefit of being involved in litigation through 2009, and I know that many hope that the process does not extend quite so long this time, but it's always wise to keep in mind. That's the basics of why and when. And now I'm going to take a little more time to go through who and where, the details of how this actually works. Who draws the lines? Well, in most states, at least for the state legislature and for congressional districts, the state legislature is in charge. In 37 states, the state legislature draws their own district lines, the district lines where they will run. In another 37 states, the state legislature draws congressional lines, and that's not including 5 states with just one congressional district that would let the legislature at it if they had more than one line to draw. In those states, the process is remarkably easy. So that's the picture for the rest of the country, but Arizona has chosen a different route. By citizen proposition and joining several of its states in the Mountain West, Arizona has set up an independent body. The states you see here in the not quite visible orange are states that have allowed commissions outside of the legislature, but still involving elected officials. Sometimes people appointed by the governor, sometimes people appointed by the Chief Justice of the elected state Supreme Court. Various and sundry people who may themselves be politicians draw the lines. In the bright orange yellow states, including Arizona, those who draw the lines are not themselves elected officials. There are very strict rules on who can become part of the institution drawing the lines. The latest state to join the club isn't actually Arizona, it's California, where I'm from. California in 2008 implemented a commission of independent citizens to draw state legislative lines, and then in 2010 extended that authority to draw congressional lines, and they'll be responsible for the first time in this cycle, no doubt learning from much of what happened in the last cycle in Arizona's experience. So this is unusual, and as I'll talk about in a moment, set up, designed to be unusually responsive. Who are these people? I mentioned before that there are certain limitations. Within the past 3 years, no one who sits on the independent commission may be an elected or appointed public office in the state. Can't be an officer of a campaign committee, can't be a paid lobbyist. There are certain restrictions on choosing the first 4 out of 5 commissioners who eventually sit. No 2 of those first 4 can be from the same county. How are these individuals chosen? The Commission on Judicial Appellate Appointments essentially puts forward nominating pools, a certain number of people affiliated with the Democratic Party, a certain number of people affiliated with the Republican Party, a certain amount of people affiliated with neither. The leadership of the state legislature chooses initially 2 people chosen by usually the majority, 2 people chosen usually by the minority, and those 4 select 1 member who is a member of neither party. And here they are. The 5 have been chosen. Some of them may be among you either now or later. And they now sit as a body as Arizona's state independent redistricting commission. They're responsible for drawing the lines, the state legislature, and for congressional districts over the next year, and perhaps, if the experience echoes the last time, over the next several years. If that should fail, or if that should be challenged in some way, the courts sit to review legislative lines, sometimes to step in if the process doesn't work from the outset, sometimes to review lines that have been proposed after the lines are drawn. And they're an important player to keep in mind in this whole process because they're quite frequently involved. It's not merely in Arizona that the courts have stepped in. This is a map of the states where courts were involved in some way in the 2000 cycle, and as you can see, there are many of them. Courts were asked to step in, intriguing, courts were asked to step in 33 states for state legislative lines, in 21 states for congressional lines. Sometimes the court said, thank you very much, but the lines are fine as they are. And sometimes the court said, these lines are improper, unlawful, we're going to return them to the primary body to redraw. Sometimes the courts actually took it upon themselves to redraw some or all of the state lines themselves. And so in 11 states, courts actually ended up drawing some or all of the state legislative lines. In 9 states, courts ended up redrawing some or all of the congressional lines. And in those states, they're very much a factor, they're very much a player in the redistricting process overall. I'll come back at the end of the presentation about why that may be so important for you all and for the communities you care most about But it's worth keeping in mind that both the commissioners and the courts as a last resort sit to oversee the process. Where are the lines drawn? That's who's doing the job, so what rules do they have to follow in order to actually draw the lines? There are two big pieces of federal law where everyone in the country has to start. The first, equal population. We talked a little bit about this. This is the reason why districts are drawn and redrawn and redrawn after each federal census every 10 years. It's the whole reason why redistricting happens. The Supreme Court has said that congressional districts, under certain sections of the Constitution, have to be really as equal as possible. As many people in one as another, as close to mathematically zero as you can. And that means this cycle in Arizona, 710,224 plus or minus a very small portion in each district. That's the target size of each congressional district. For the state legislature, there's a little more leeway based on a different provision of the Constitution, different rules, different standards. It's generally understood that states have up to 10% leeway to deviate from perfectly equal population under the federal Constitution if there's a good reason for doing so. If there's a bad reason for doing so, states may not have any leeway at all. But for good reasons, like following the rest of their constitutional commands rather consistently, states can draw lines that happen to be over or underpopulated by a small amount. There's some leeway to work with. And that means up to 213,100 people-ish, more or less, in each of the state's Senate districts that will be drawn. So far, so good. I now have the responsibility to talk to you about the Voting Rights Act, and I think I have 3 days to do it. This will be the shortest introduction it's possible to give, and I hope to give you just a taste of what the Voting Rights Act requires, because this is some of the most intricate law that applies to redistricting. It's some of the most intricate law that applies flat out anywhere in the country. And I'm not even going to be able to talk to you about that. So I will use the one slide over here to talk to you about the Voting Rights Act. There are two provisions that will apply in Arizona, and there are some of them. This one, Section 2, applies across the country. Arizona also has some special rules that I'll talk about in a second. If you hear people talk about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, what they're talking about is preserving the political power of minority communities. And this is done in large part because for a very long time, the districting process, like many other electoral laws, were used to systematically break up the voting power, the political power of racial and ethnic minorities. Two basic ways in which this was done. The first, called cracking, in which a community, a solid community with a voice of its own, district lines were drawn directly through the community, splitting that community up into a whole bunch of different districts and making sure that they would never able to be organized, never able to elect a candidate of their own choice by banding together. Split up into separate districts, the community's fragmented power and can never have a voice of its own in the legislature. The other very common tactic is called packing. You take as many minority voters as you possibly can, shove them all into one district, and although they'll be able to elect someone reliably if they organize from that district, that means their power in the surrounding communities is going to be massively diluted. They'll have a reduced voice by virtue of the fact that they've been concentrated in one area and not allowed to influence others. Because of this, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It's been said, and I agree with this, to be the most successful piece of civil rights legislation ever in the country's history. And what it does is it sets up rules to say when lines have to watch out so as not to intentionally or unintentionally break up, fragment, dilute minority voting power. Section 2 applies across the country. There are three basic threshold tests, three basic threshold questions to ask. Are half of the potential voters, is half of the electorate in a relatively concentrated area minorities? Is there a big minority population that lives relatively close together? Second question, would that community generally vote as a block, given the choice, for the same type of candidate? That doesn't mean, do they all generally vote for Democrats? Do they all generally vote for Republicans? It means they generally vote for the same type of Democrat or same type of Republican. And do the voters in the rest of the area generally vote for somebody else? Some other type of Democrat, some other type of Republican. So that if you didn't watch out for where that minority power was, they would be subsumed in the larger community and unable to exercise their effective voice, to actually elect a candidate of choice. Those three questions look for a fairly big group and see if they're voting differently from the rest of the population. If so, you then go through what the courts call the totality of the circumstances test. This is why they pay lawyers. I'm not going to go through each of these factors now, but there are a tremendous number of factors to consider to basically see, is that minority community protected, or do they face a threat of discrimination or a threat of reducing their effective electoral power? And if the group is large and votes differently from the rest of the population, and if they're not protected in the totality of the circumstances, then the Voting Rights Act has a command that says do not dilute that group's power. That the people drawing the lines have a responsibility to draw an opportunity district, and a district where there is an equal opportunity for that minority community to elect a representative of choice. That's the thumbnail sketch of Section 2. Arizona is also subject to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and this only applies in certain areas. They're the areas I've outlined in, again, the mustard yellow you can't really see, are partially covered states, where either a county or a town is covered. Many people don't know that parts of New York and parts of Michigan and parts of California and parts of South Dakota are covered by Section 5. The areas in the bright yellow or bright orange, depending on how you see that color, are covered for the entire state, and of course that's Arizona. What this means is that Arizona has to pre-clear, has to check in with either a federal district court in the District of Columbia or the Department of Justice for any electoral change that might influence minorities, might influence minority political power, including redistricting. And so before the redistricting maps in Arizona are allowed to go into effect, the Redistricting Commission will have to submit those maps to the Department of Justice, which will have to sign off on them to see as a whole whether they can be pre-cleared, whether there's enough evidence to show that they do not reduce minority political power. The Department of Justice asks, again, two massively oversimplified tests. The real calculation is somewhat more complex. But in the basics, is the new map intended to dilute minority votes? Or does it actually dilute minority voting power? Does it leave minorities worse off under the new map than they would have been under the old map? And that's essentially what the Department of Justice will be looking for with respect to Arizona's plan. And every plan within Arizona, local county commissions, as well as state legislative lines, as well as federal congressional lines, have to go through the same thing. Beyond the Voting Rights Act, it's also possible to consider race or ethnicity. This is something that a lot of people don't understand. The Voting Rights Act protects certain communities of voters, I've mentioned before. Even beyond that, it is okay to consider race or ethnicity among all of the other factors that the Commission will be considering in order to figure out where to draw the lines. The Supreme Court has said that race and ethnicity can't predominate, can't be the sole reason, can't be the most important reason for drawing districts that aren't specifically protected by the Voting Rights Act. But that doesn't mean there's a ban on considering race or ethnicity at all. It can be considered just fine outside of the Voting Rights Act context as long as it's in the mix with everything else. And that is the shortest introduction to the Voting Rights Act I guarantee you'll ever hear. After federal law, Arizona's commission, at least on the state level, at least for state legislative districts or for federal congressional districts, has a few other factors to consider. And I'm just going to go very quickly through them now to give you a taste of what they entail. This is what the state constitution and state statutes set out as things that the commission has to consider in making its appraisal and deciding where to draw the lines. Compactness generally has to do with the shape of a district, how a district looks more or less. And there are over 30 different definitions that political scientists have proposed, all sorts of different measurements that result in different answers. If you take a district and you apply one standard, it may be somewhat more compact under one definition and somewhat less compact under another. The general ways to measure, either they focus on the boundaries of the district, or they focus on the dispersion, how spread out the district is from a central core, or they focus on where people live, the population distribution inside the district. Those are three basic big categories of how you assess compactness. More or less it boils down to, is the district kind of strung out, or is the district kind of close together? And that's about the most scientific test that the courts have used over time, at least in other states. Generally speaking, the district on the left would be considered less compact. The district on the right would be considered more compact by most definitions. Contiguity is in some ways even easier. Contiguity just has to do with whether all parts of the district are connected to each other. Do they all touch at one point? And so the district on the left, not contiguous. The district on the right, contiguous. Communities of interest, and I will come back to this at the end of the presentation because it may well be the way in which people can be most effective in this process, is something else the Commission has to decide. I've put up a definition here. It's not Arizona's definition. The definition in Arizona is up to the Commission. It's not further defined in state law other than to say the Commission shall consider communities of interest, shall respect communities of interest. Common definitions are pretty broad. And here I've shown you Kansas's definition because it's fairly representative. In Kansas, the way they define a community of interest is a social, cultural, racial, ethnic, economic interest that's common to the population in an area, that a group of people have in common, and which they might want to see represented in the legislature or in the federal congressional delegation. It's the basic unit of representation. A community of interest speaks out with its interest and tells a representative what to represent. And that can be different things in different parts of the state. There's no one right answer about what a community is because different things will matter to different populations in different parts of the state and may be entirely legitimate to consider as real live communities of interest to different populations in different parts of the state. Some communities of interest, as Kansas explicitly recognized, lend themselves more readily than others to being embodied in legislative districts, but Kansas, I think, very smartly left the overall definition broad so that it could hear from the public about which interests were most important to them in various parts of the state. Arizona commissioners also have to consider, when drawing the lines, political boundaries. The state constitution requires the commission to follow, where practicable, geographic boundaries, to follow city, town, and county lines, again, where practicable. Not all of these things will be practical to do all together. Sometimes these various criteria run up against each other, and it's up to the commission to decide how it's going to resolve those conflicts. It may want to resolve those conflicts differently, again, in different parts of the state, and that too is okay. A lot of people have in their mind that city, town, county lines are very nice and regular, that we all live in squares. Not so. That is actually a map of Phoenix, and it's more regular than most. And you'll see down in the southwest some portions that look to the common eye like they've been gerrymandered, like they've been rigged. Well, really, they're just annexation fights, their boundaries about where city services should be provided or not. And this is actually quite a bit more regular than many of the cities in town. I chose a local example, but I could easily have shown you some cities and towns from elsewhere in the country that look virtually unrecognizable as civic entities. So just important to remember, and important for the commissioners to take note, that these aren't necessarily going to look like regular figures, that civic boundaries grow and stretch and change in different ways for all kinds of different reasons, and sometimes seem quite odd when on the page. Partisanship and competition, I know, has been amply litigated in Arizona, and I know is a bone of very serious contention. There's one basic requirement that I'll touch on first, and that's that the commission can't consider candidates' homes when it's drawing the lines. Why? Well, there's a pretty good reason for this, and I'll give you an example out of Illinois. In 2000, a young state senator from Illinois named Barack Obama wanted to run for Congress. He wanted to run against then longtime incumbent Bobby Rush, and engaged in the primary process. This is always going to be a very heavily Democratic district. Ran in the Illinois primary for that congressional district against Congressman Rush, and got about 30% of the primary vote with a very hasty campaign. And this was enough to signal to the congressman that this was going to be a potentially very formidable challenger someday. Well, that is where then State Senator Barack Obama lived in 2000, and that is the congressional district in 2002. And as you'll see, it was drawn a block to the north, 2 blocks to the west, small Chicago blocks, and a block to the south, neatly leaving the state senator well outside of Bobby Rush's district for the next election in 2002. You'll also see there's a park that stretches well to the south. There's no other community that this is connected to. This was designed quite specifically in order to surgically carve out the blocks around Barack Obama's house in order to attempt to make sure that he would no longer be running for Congress against Bobby Rush. That's one of the reasons why the commission in Arizona is precluded from considering where candidates' homes live. It's an attempt to combat stuff like this. The commission also can't use registration or voting history in the initial phase of the process when it's just getting started. I want to emphasize there's also a lot of misconception about this particular requirement. The commission not only can, but in many ways will have to consider registration and party data later on in the process, both in order to comply with the Voting Rights Act, which, as I just mentioned, requires you to see which types of candidates which different populations vote for, so you need to know voting data in order to understand this, and also in order to comply with the competitiveness requirement. This will be just an intro, because in order to go through the competitiveness requirement, I'll need 9 years back and forth through the courts. The Constitution requires that where it does not significantly or substantially detract from the other goals I've just mentioned, that the commission consider how competitive a district is. I know you'll hear more on this from Professor McDonald. One quick note, a lot of people expect that they'll be able to know when a district is competitive by seeing if an election turns out to be 50-50. If it's a real close squeaker of a race, then they think the district must be competitive. Not necessarily so. As you know well, there are many things that factor into how an election turns out on the end. And you can have a district that's fairly well balanced between Democrats and Republicans and still have, because an incumbent's running, because of campaign financing, because the candidate's really good or really quite bad, still have elections that don't work out at the end of the day to be 50-50 at all. And so it's important to remember that this not only has the caveat where it does not substantially detract from the other goals, draw competitive districts, it's aimed at trying to balance out the partisan affiliation of the people in the districts, not trying to guarantee a certain result at the end of the day. Few last caveats for the process. This process isn't necessarily about districts that look pretty. This is a district that may be familiar to you. It's Arizona's 2nd congressional district, and to me, this is beautiful because of what it accomplishes. So I have done this many times, and I'm not going to take the time to do it today, but when I present this, I ask people to reflect on districts outside of their state, which they may not know quite as well, and to have in their minds, is this a good district or a bad district? And so think to yourself right now, just for 30 seconds, about whether these districts are good or bad. And I'll tell you a very little bit about each of them. The district in the upper left was a Voting Rights Act district designed for the Voting Rights Act and elected the first Hispanic representative from Illinois, in fact from the Midwest, ever in the state. The district at the top center is a district that follows the South Carolina coastline and has a lot of development issues with respect to the coast, has a lot of tidal patterns that concern the citizens of that district. The district in the top right, which a lot of people intuitively like, instinctually like, is a district in the northwest corner of Arkansas. It's among the least competitive districts in the entire country, and it's also unconstitutionally overpopulated because they just followed nice little lines, but that didn't actually follow where the people live. District on the lower left is a Virginia district in the Chesapeake Basin. It actually has a lot of concerns about the shipping patterns coming through in common. District in the lower center was a district that was struck down by the Supreme Court because it was drawn specifically to deprive a growing Latino majority of its political power just as it was about to exercise it for the first time. The district in the lower right is among the most competitive districts in the country. It's the 6th district of Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia, and was what was left over after the Pennsylvania legislature essentially carved up the rest of the state. What's the lesson that I would hope you would draw from this? It's that you can't know whether a district is good or not until you know what it's trying to achieve. And I use as an example whether you can tell whether that's a good singer. Many people have followed Susan Boyle. She appeared on Britain's Got Talent. People saw her walk out onto the stage, and many, many, many people thought to themselves, oh my God, this is going to be an embarrassment. This is going to be awful. Well, there's no way you can know from looking at her what's going to come out of her mouth. And as it turns out, she's a wonderful singer, as we all learned. And the very fact that that took people by surprise tells us something about the process. There's no reason that we should have thought one way or another about how she could sing based on that alone. There's no reason that tells us any information. We need to know far more about her and about her singing ability before we judge her. But because she didn't fit people's idea of what a singer looked like, they immediately judged her as bad. And I would hope that you would draw the same lessons for districts. You can't know whether a district is good or bad just by looking at it walk onto the stage. You have to actually know what it's trying to achieve. The last bit of today's conversation, here I'll wrap up and take questions, is about how to get involved, how to get engaged. And I know Professor McDonald is going to talk to you much more about that. If you don't want to consider it all, and there will be some among you who certainly do want to consider it all, then there's an easy way to keep it simple and to have a very real impact. And that's with talking about and communicating and letting the Commission know about your communities of interest. The Commission gives you a relatively unique opportunity, and not one that's duplicated in many other states, to let the people who are drawing the lines know, in a way that they're legally obligated to consider, where your communities are that should be represented, and to tell them, here is my community, here are the boundaries of my community, please consider this community when you're drawing the lines. That opportunity doesn't exist in a lot of states, but it does exist here, and it's tremendously powerful and important. Not only does your ability to testify at hearings or to work with others and nonprofits in the area to assist you in that testimony, does that inform the Commission's work? Not only does that end up reflected in the official map in quite a few areas, it also is a way of communicating to the press what is important in the state, not just the horse race, but also the communities that should be represented in the final allocation of power. It's a way to communicate to nonprofit partners whom they should be looking out for. It's a way to communicate to the Department of Justice why maps may have been drawn in certain ways and not others. And it's a way of communicating to the courts, as I mentioned, who are watching over the process and may yet be involved. And so in a number of different ways, your ability to present your communities of interest to the Commission is among the most powerful ways to make your voice and the voices of those you care about known. And this doesn't have to be fancy. So this is my attempt to draw my neighborhood in Los Angeles on Google Maps. You could do exactly the same thing with a road map and a marker. It doesn't have to be that hard. It just takes your sitting down and talking to and thinking about your community and trying to inform the commissioners about what that community looks like. That's where I'll leave the presentation. There's plenty more information available. I think Professor Steen mentioned the Citizen's Guide to Redistricting, which is free and online. It's an introduction to the process with a little more meat behind what I've said today. And I'll be happy to take some questions.
Okay, let me just give you a little bit of coaching. Checking. Okay. If you have questions, there's a mic in the center aisle, and so you can come to the mic and line up orderly. No pushing and shoving, please. And Professor Levitt will just take you in order. Don't all rush at once.
I was going to say, the no pushing and shoving may have been a little harsh. You can push
All right.
and shove
Yeah,
more than that.
exactly.
Should be. Give it a shot.
Can you hear me?
I can, but I'm sure everyone else cannot. There we go. That's on.
Okay. So I'm interested in proportional representation. Winner take all, I feel I'm never represented.
There are a lot of political scientists who are happy to agree with you. And it's an appropriate place to bring that up because we happen to be at an educational institution. There are certainly ways to advocate for those systems most forcefully in local communities. In cities or in counties, there may be ample ways to change a winner-take-all system to something that is better designed to embrace multiple voices. What we have in Arizona is a constitutional requirement for state legislative and for federal lines, and so at least for the next few years, those are the parameters within which we've got to tangle with the redistricting process. But on to the future, I know there are many who will be happy to join you in trying to press for something different.
Excuse me. I had a question on the Section 5. Is it the voter rights portion?
Yes, sir.
At what point does our commission here, are they to be aware of what those requirements are as they move from now forward to May? Or is their process kind of completed and then the Justice Department reviews what they've done to see if there's a compliance with that section?
I think, so if everybody heard the question was about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act and whether the commission has to be aware of and thinking about that process starting from now, or whether the Department of Justice will step in and review later. And I think the answer is both. I think that the commission absolutely needs to be aware of the requirements, another F coming up. I think the commission absolutely has to be aware of the requirements of Section 5 when it's drawing the lines from the get-go. And that's also true in other communities throughout the state, not just for state legislative or federal lines. Formally, the Department of Justice has the chance to put a stamp of approval on at the end of the process, and sometimes it's a bit of a negotiation. Sometimes the end of the process isn't the end of the process. The Department of Justice will review lines and say, this over here, we don't have enough proof, or this over here doesn't strike me as quite right, try it again. But from the get-go, in considering where to draw the lines, the commission certainly has to be aware of the responsibility under Section 5 and has to be drawing the lines with that in mind, knowing that it cannot retrogress, that it can't make minority voters worse off where they have effective political power through the state.
Okay. At what point would a minority population no longer be considered minority as they're gaining more population in the country? And then there are, do the minorities just consist of like Latinos and African Americans? What about Asians and other Italian Americans, Hispanic? That's basically my question.
So there are certain racial minority groups and certain, well, any racial minority is embraced by the Voting Rights Act, and that means a minority of voters of a certain race in a particular area, and language minorities as well. So Latino or Hispanic individuals are included, particularly in Arizona, but also elsewhere, separately brought under the protection of the Voting Rights Act by amendments over time. And so that you do have, there are traditional minorities who have taken advantage of the protections of the Voting Rights Act in the past. But the Voting Rights Act simply talks about a racial minority community that has the opportunity to exercise effective political power, or that once had, and not decreasing that opportunity. And so that applies to anyone and everyone. If there's an Asian community that's of sufficient size to exercise effective political power wherever they happen to be, they are also protected. The Voting Rights Act is very pragmatic in that way and also very expansive. And so it really depends on very nuanced, on-the-ground calculations about the size of a particular community in a particular place and about their opportunities, either in the future or in the past, to exercise effective political power. And the fact that Arizona is subject to Section 2 and also covered by Section 5 interacts in different ways and can be quite complicated to work out the nuances of, but it basically means there's a lot of protection for all kinds of racial and language minorities in Arizona. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but it's an interesting question. So the question was about, as the population changes, will those racial groups that have been minorities in the past at some point no longer be? And it's an interesting question about what the Voting Rights Act will do now. That's still a long ways off. I think that now there is no state, at least where statewide, any particular group that had been a racial minority in the past is now a single majority of that state. I'm not aware of any place where that's happened. And so it's interesting to think about, and it gives a lot of professors a lot to write about. But I don't know that we've actually got that circumstance anywhere in the country just yet.
In looking at the process, the redistricting process obviously uses census data. Looking at it in terms of the racial group categories in census data, there is a some other race category. Does that ever figure in how lines are drawn?
It hasn't yet that I'm aware of, and here's why. So the basic way that the Department of Justice approaches the Voting Rights Act and the census data is it looks at all of the people who have said, and it's self-reported everywhere in the census, has said that they're African American, or who've said that they're Native American, or who've said that they're Latino or Hispanic language minority ancestry. And then, as you noted, there's a category for some other race. The Voting Rights Act protects populations of sufficient size to be able to exercise effective voting rights. The two different sections work slightly differently. For Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the one that applies across the country, you have to be at least half of the potential voters in an area, at least 50%. For Section 5, it applies even when groups don't reach that level, as long as they've got effective political power. So it could still apply at 40% or 35% or something significant, but not quite a majority. The some other race population hasn't yet, I think we've seen in any place, been sufficiently large to be embraced by the Voting Rights Act in particular, to get the protection of the Voting Rights Act. That may well happen at some point. I don't know, nothing's been brought to my attention from this round of census data where that population is so large that it would qualify for Voting Rights Act protection itself, but it may be. It may be that in a town somewhere, there's a town with a some other race population that's quite substantial, and then it would be, if it voted coherently, if it voted cohesively as a block, it would be protected.
Tying into all of that, I think that there's also the distinction, we of course are under Section 203 as well, so you have the redistricting requirements which can sometimes overlap with Section 203 voting assistance requirements for minority languages, and I know that that can be something that can be somewhat confusing to our population in Arizona at certain times, wanting to know why one potential minority which would be covered under redistricting may not have the same kind of coverage under Section 203 and some of those subtleties. So I don't know if you'd like to elaborate on that, but that I think can sometimes refine how people look at these two things, because they are very, very different.
They're
and can be very confusing.
Yes, and I'm going to try not to elaborate on them too much because I don't want to add to the confusion. So you're absolutely right to point out the issue that there are several protections of the Voting Rights Act. Some of them apply more directly to the redistricting process. Those are the ones I've discussed here. Some apply more to the balloting process, to actually going to the polls or to receiving election information. There are even provisions beyond that that apply, and I'm sure you all would fall asleep even faster if I were to give you a course on election law in its entirety. The provisions of Section 203 and of particular language assistance apply to different groups. I don't want to get into the specifics here because I want to keep the focus on the provisions that really do apply most in the redistricting process, and that's really Section 2 applying throughout the country to groups that are at least half of a population in an area, and Section 5, which applies to any group with effective political power, even if that's short of half or just short of half of a population. Any other pushing and shoving is welcome. Please, actually, if you would use the mic, that would help.
There's a reason that Arizona's under the second part. Could you share with us that reason, and then when and if that might not exist?
Absolutely. So there are portions of the Voting Rights Act, thank you very much for the question. There are portions of the Voting Rights Act that are permanent, that were put in place in 1965 and have been amended since, but don't risk expiration at any time. Section 2 is among them, the requirement that applies across the country everywhere. That's among the permanent portions of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 is a temporary portion and was first put in place in the 60s and then expanded over time. It basically applies to any jurisdiction, small city, small county, big state. It's why some of the places on the map, like parts of Michigan or parts of New Hampshire or parts of South Dakota, are covered under Section 5. Applies anywhere where a test or device was used at one point, where you had to jump through some hurdle in order to be registered and vote, and where, in part as a result, where either registration rates or actual voting rates were abnormally low, below 50% of the population, and it's keyed to 3 big presidential elections in the 60s and 70s, 1964, 1968, 1972. That's when coverage began. There are certain additional reasons that states are covered, and language minority provisions are one of them. When the Voting Rights Act was amended, they also added coverage under very similar circumstances to states that had substantial language minority populations. Arizona also certainly one of those. Some jurisdictions have chosen to, it's called bail out of Section 5. In essence, if you've improved situation for minorities consistently over the last 10 years, if you've not had the Department of Justice stand up and object to a plan or part of a plan, if there's been active improvement for minority rights over time, the jurisdiction's eligible to ask the district court in DC to bail out, and various largely counties have done so over time. A state has not bailed out in total yet. The Congress will next consider this portion of the Voting Rights Act. It's set to expire periodically, and so Congress just recently re-upped Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in 2006, and it will be quite some time before it considers again. It was re-upped for 25 years. They'll have to consider that coverage formula again in 20 years, and so that's when Congress will next have the issue before them. There are also legal challenges. There's now one in particular in the District Court of DC to Section 5, and I think everybody's got a different prediction as to how that'll turn out. But right now, Section 5 is in place. That's why Arizona is covered, and it's very powerful for the communities it protects.